Welcome to an introduction to Balinese language. Balinese language is obviously the language spoken by the Balinese on the island of Bali predominantly. Probably 3 million people roughly. Great language to learn if you're living on Bali, because Indonesian probably won't get you very far in some of the more remote villages. Certainly where I used to live in Bali, you almost never heard Indonesian back then. So Balinese is very, very similar. It's the same family of languages as Indonesian. Proto-Malay, I think they call them. Very similar to Javanese, Sundanese, all the regional languages basically, right through Polynesia, similar languages. Far more difficult to learn than Indonesian. It's spoken, it's a far richer language for the Balinese because it's their first language. It's extremely important to them. They love it. They love it when you speak it. You have a lot of fun. The Balinese love humour. Some of the funniest people I've ever lived amongst, anywhere that I've ever lived, has been the Balinese. Hilariously funny. And you have a lot of fun. You have a lot of fun if you learn Balinese. So that's what we're here to do, to have an introduction to the Balinese language. The pronunciations of Balinese are very similar to Indonesian. So really the biggest difference between Balinese and Indonesian is that the A's on the end of a Balinese word are pronounced as So ada in Indonesian would be pronounced in Balinese as ada, ada. You hear that A sound slightly differently pronounced all over Bali. Ada, ada, ada. It depends on where you are, but you'll pick up on that very quickly as to where you are, and you have a lot of fun sometimes by learning the accents of certain areas. People think it's hilarious if you come out with some of the funnier accents, or what's considered to be funnier accents in other parts of Bali. A's on that appear in the prefix will also be pronounced as So if you see a prefix with A in it, it'll be pronounced as and not a. So an example of that would be the Low Balinese word for the word to eat, madar. M is spelled M-A, pronounced as M, madar. Most other things you'll pick up. There's a couple of very, very slight differences in pronunciation, but basically that's it. It's a richer language. You'll hear things spoken. They'll contract a lot of things in Balinese. You'll hear that a lot. The word for to leave is kalahin. Kalahin in Indonesian, tinggalkan. That'll be pronounced as kalin. That's a very common thing where they contract the sound from kalahin to kalin. So we'll get down to the levels now. You'll find that most of the regional languages in Indonesia, probably all of them, have different levels, some more than others. Javanese probably being the most extreme of all the languages with different levels. Balinese has quite a few different levels. There's basically two levels, low and high. In low we say bahasa biasa, and in high bahasa halus. Halus is divided into, the main part of halus is halus middle, which means the middle part. Halus tinggi, which is high of the high Balinese language, and that's usually reserved for other people and their families. And you have halus sor, which is low-high, which is used for yourself and family members. And you'll have one more level, which is kasar. Now kasar, maybe kasar, coarse that is, rough, offensive, depends on the context. If we use a kasar word for an animal, for instance, it might be entirely appropriate. So it all depends on the context. It'll be obvious whether people are trying to be offensive or not. It's used a lot in humour. People find it hilarious in Balinese when people use inappropriate levels. But we won't get too confused on the levels, because it'll come as we learn the language. At first, it can be very, very difficult to try and get your head around the levels after learning Indonesian, where it's predominantly the one level like English is. In Balinese, it is considerably more complex, and you really need to know the different castes so that you know what level to use. I was very fortunate in that where I learnt my Balinese initially, the people almost insisted that I learn a polite form, a high form. And if I made a mistake, it would always be on the side, I would err on the side of caution by using a higher form than necessary. And it always stood me in good stead. And people were always very impressed with the language that I'd learned when I first learned it. They were very happy that I was learning the higher language. And I would recommend to anyone learning Balinese that they become very familiar with the higher form of language. It's a polite form that you really can't go wrong with until you get to learn the ropes as to know what level to use where. It's a very interesting, Balinese is extremely interesting, very rewarding. And if you live in Bali, you'll have a ball by learning Balinese, even if you start to come out with just the first few things. Now, we're going to start off by saying something that the most common thing that you hear in Bali. It's their greeting, and their greeting is mau kemana, which is Indonesian. They say the same thing. They say, where are you going? Which we don't do in Indonesian at all. But the Balinese, if they see someone walking along the street, they always inquire as to where they're going. So, in low Balinese, we'll start off with, the most common way of saying where are you going is kal kijer, or kar kijer. Kal is short for bakal. Kar is short for lakar. So we have kal kijer or kar kijer, very commonly heard. We also have in high language, which is the language that is very worth learning initially, and that is jagi lunga kijer. Jagi lunga kijer. And that is high language. So that's what we ask people when we see them walking along the streets. In my village, where I learnt, which was Penistan and Clod, which is west of Ubud, there was no one of high caste, so I almost never heard high language spoken. But because we're in close proximity to people in surrounding villages that had high caste people, then it was very good to know high language, Bahasa Alus.